romance of Italian football truly knows no bounds. It speaks for its culture, its cities, and its people. Francesco Totti, the Emperor of Rome. Andrea Pirlo, a Renaissance artist. Roberto Baggio, a stunning architect. It's also romantic. The Stadio Diego Maradona sits in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. Venezia's Stadio Pierluigi Penso floats on its canals just like its stunning buildings. And the Stadio Olimpico still echoes like the Colosseum. And romance aside, Italian football is a results business too. Or at least historically it has been. Only Brazil have won more World Cups than the Italians. The famous Azzurri won 2 of the first 3 editions, adding the 3rd title in 1982 and the 4th in 2006. Milan, Inter and Juventus spring straight to mind when you're asked to think of European footballing powerhouses. Milan, of course, the 2nd most successful club of all time in the European Championship, with a whopping 7 titles. Italian football heritage may be one of style, but it is also built on winning. We are going to discover where this began and where it's gone. The 30th of April 1899 was the unofficial beginning of the Italian national team, when an Italian selection played a Swiss 11, losing 2-0 in Turin. But the team's first official match was held in Milan on the 15th of May 1910. Italy defeated France by a score of 6-2. Then, the first scent of true success arrived at the Summer Olympics in Amsterdam, 1928. Italy took home the bronze medal after a mad result, beating Egypt 11-3 in the 3rd place game. The first stars on the badge, however, came in 1934 and 1938. Uruguay won the first ever World Cup in 1930 before the Italians laid down a marker for the rest of the world. Their 1934 triumph is now marred in controversy. Italy hosted the tournament under the dictatorship of the infamous Benito Mussolini, and in reality the championship was one of the early sports washing events. The football was part of a much bigger propaganda vehicle conducted by the far-right Italian regime at the time. In 1938, the World Cup was held in neighbouring France, and not only did Italy triumph again, but in doing so, they helped bolster their reputation as a great footballing nation, and not just a team that won a rigged home tournament as some seemed to suggest 4 years earlier. Then, decades later, in 1968, they hosted the European Championship. They won that tournament, as they did recently, capturing their 2nd continental title in London in 2021. Italian teams won the European Cup 3 times in a row between 1963 and 65. Milanese teams, in fact. It was AC Milan who defeated the then tournament holders Benfica in London in 63. That was followed by back-to-back title wins for their city rivals Inter. The Nerazzurri beat Real Madrid in 1984 and Benfica a year later. 4 years later, the title returned to Italy and Milan in particular, this time to the red and black side of the city, to make it 2-2 in terms of European titles. Milan defeated Ajax and Madrid, and with that, 50% of the last 8 European Cups were won by the 2 Milan clubs. Despite the 60s being a super competitive time in European football, Inter and Milan were playing games of their own on the biggest European stage. Having said that, an Italian side wouldn't lift the trophy again until 1985. The 70s and 80s were dominated by the Dutch, Germans and the English. In 11 editions of the European Cup during those years, Ajax, Bayern Munich and Liverpool all won 3 titles each. Where were the Italians? This was certainly a blip for the Azzurri's club sides, but they hadn't left the picture. Perhaps just been unlucky. In that period, specifically between 1972 and 1984, Italian sides lost 4 European Cup finals. Inter failed to overtake Milan when they lost to Ajax in 1972, and in 1973 Juventus tried their luck, but Johan Cruyff's Ajax dream team defeated them too. In 1983, Juventus reached their 2nd final and lost again, this time to Hamburg from Germany. And in 1984, Roma made it to the final in their home stadium, but unfortunately for them, they were defeated by Liverpool on penalties. Finally, the Italians ended their losing run in 1985. However, they would do so under horrendous circumstances. Juventus' 1-0 victory over Liverpool in Brussels will forever be remembered not for the football match, but for being the scene of the Heysel Stadium disaster. For a number of reasons, fighting broke out between fans, resulting in the collapse of a wall and the death of 39 mainly Juventus supporters. All of this took place before the game and it still went ahead. 600 people were also injured. The tragedy resulted in all English football clubs being placed under an indefinite ban by UEFA, which was only lifted in the 1990-91 season, with Liverpool being excluded for an additional 2 years, later reduced to 1. The disaster was later described as the darkest hour in the history of UEFA competition. Later in the century, AC Milan began to take history into their own hands. Their team of the early 90s was one of football's most famous ever. They were essentially the Galacticos of the decade, with names like Gullit, Van Basten, Rijkaard, Baresi and Maldini all in the team. They streaked ahead of rivals Inter in the overall European titles leaderboard after winning back-to-back titles in 1989 and 1990. Then, in 1994, they romped to a 4-0 final victory over Barcelona in Athens, a statement result from a statement team. In 1996, the final returned to Rome, but it was Juventus who ran out the victors over Ajax. The game was actually the first final of 3 in a row for Juventus, who would lose the next 2 to Dortmund and Real Madrid. So for decades on end, Juventus and the Milan teams were as big, if not bigger, than the likes of Barcelona and Manchester United. They regularly appeared in finals and regularly won the European Cup. The SerieA was home to the world's greatest superstars, and their teams were respected for their quality and their results. 2003 brought the type of match that the Italian Football Association could only dream of. The first and only ever all-Italian European Cup final. AC Milan overcame Juventus on penalties in Manchester. 2 seasons later, Milan lost a famous final in Istanbul to Liverpool, but got their revenge 2 seasons after that, defeating the Anfield side in Athens to claim their 7th European crown. The Milan team of the 2000s was also much feared across Europe. They had names like the legendary Cafu, Nesta, Pirlo, Kaká, Seedorf, Shevchenko and Inzaghi. The new generation might not be aware, but this star-studded team that took Milan to 3 finals and won their 6th and 7th European titles were seen as just as big a club as any, and they still have more European titles than everybody else bar Real Madrid. Let's not forget, AC Milan are true European royalty. As this great Milan side faded, so too did Italian football in general. Its leading lights opted for other clubs and leagues outside of Italy, and its teams stopped appearing in finals and winning big trophies. The exception to that rule, and the most recent Italian Champions League victory, came 13 years ago, as Jose Mourinho led Inter Milan to the title. In peak Mourinho style, Inter battled their way through a tough semi-final against a much-fancied Barcelona, before beating Bayern Munich in the final in Madrid. Inter were far from favourites, and their football was far from dazzling, but a side made in the image and likeness of peak Mourinho was always going to be hard to beat. The rise of Italian football on every level was as splendid as it was steady, just like a typical Italian back four might be. And we hadn't even mentioned the Beatlemania type hype and frenzy that surrounded the one and only Diego Maradona. In his stunning spell with Napoli in the late 80s, they won an unprecedented 2 league titles and a UEFA Cup. Arrigo Sacchi, the ex-Milan manager, revolutionised football. Since the imperial reign of Sacchi has come a run of great results for Italian football in terms of managers. In fact, 5 of the 8 Champions League quarter-finalists of this 2022-23 season have Italian coaches. The colours on the flag are green, white and red, but the famous blue shirt of the Azzurri is almost as global as the flag itself. Without the Italians and their fine clubs, the history of European football would be nowhere near as wondrous. Sadly, in the next part of the story, we have to talk about how in recent years Italian football has been way off its best. But in part 3, we will look to the future. Stay tuned.